You won't find the word abortion anywhere in them. But these two bills moving through the Florida legislature could amount to a backdoor expansion of Florida's statewide abortion ban, which is already one of the strictest abortion bans in the country. We'll tell you how in our latest daily update from the Florida legislature's 2025 legislative session. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. This is going to be an update from day 29 of the Florida legislature's 60-day legislative session. So we are almost halfway home. And I want to start today's show just dialing things back a little bit. I think I was pretty open last fall that I supported Amendment 4, which was the constitutional amendment that got put on the ballot by petition drive that would have essentially ended Florida's statewide abortion ban and basically prohibited future government interference with with access to abortion. And one of the reasons I felt so strongly about this, and I think I seem to recall that I recorded a podcast to this effect or making this argument, was that somebody needed to throw some kind of brake or collar on the Florida legislature to slow it down because it was not going to stop getting increasingly extreme on this issue. There was not an end to just how far the state would go, both at cutting off access to abortion specifically, but also just eroding all sorts of rights to reproductive health care, to sexual education, all of this stuff. There was no end to just how far they would go, and somebody needed to, like I said, throw a brake on this. I think probably most folks listening or watching this know that Florida already has one of the strictest abortion bans in the nation. In Florida now, we ban abortion after just 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is, before many women even know they're pregnant. By the time they realize they've got a pregnancy, it is too late to get an abortion in Florida. But it's not like it's going to stop there, right? Particularly when you're in such an extremely gerrymandered state where the vast majority of legislators are beholden only to the furthest extreme, the most extreme voters. Those are the people that decide primary elections. Those are who they have to worry about, and those who they are who they are ultimately trying to placate with issues like this. And so there's not a point where they're not going to say like 6-week abortion ban. That's far enough. And I bring all this up because I think yesterday, day 29, was sort of a perfect encapsulation of that, particularly in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where they heard two bills in particular that I want to talk about. The first, I'm not sure if we've talked about this one before, but this is Senate Bill 1288, and this is called an act relating to parental rights because, of course, that's what it's called. But, broadly speaking, what this bill would do is essentially prevent minors from accessing all sorts of just sort of basic healthcare stuff without a parental permission. It would, for instance, a teenager a doctor could not prescribe birth control pills to a high school senior without their parent approving, for instance, just to give one example. It goes so far as it would give parents the right to review or learn any answers their minors give to confidential healthcare screenings and stuff. Any kind of survey that they might do. No longer any anonymity for that sort of thing. Parents would have the right to review their child's answers, no matter what. This is one of those bills that where, superficially it might seem like it makes a lot of sense. Like, of course, if you're a parent, you'd want to know what's going on with your child, particularly around sort of important stuff like healthcare. But it gets you to some pretty crazy results. And so, like, just to use one example, the original version of this bill would have prevented teenagers from getting testing for STIs, for sexually transmitted infections. They couldn't have even gotten a test without their parents knowing. And so the bill sponsor is Senator Aaron Grahl, Republican from the Vero Beach area, and also, I believe, if memory serves, the sponsor of Florida's 6-week abortion ban, or one of them. I guess to her credit, she sort of softened the bill slightly. She threw an amendment on there that would allow teenagers to get testing for STI and testing without telling a parent, but not any sort of treatment for whatever they might have without their parent knowing, which is just kind of a crazy way to split that issue. Like, why, in what world do we think it's okay? Like, we think it's a compromise to allow someone to get tested for a disease, but not any treatment for a disease without having to rope in someone else. And the other thing I want to talk about with this is it just sort of like blows my mind in the context of these issues. These are always these are always cast as like ways to sort of like get government out of the way and like allow families to work together as if there's something preventing that right now. The solution, if you want to know what's going on with your kid, the solution here is to have a good relationship, a healthy relationship with your kid. You shouldn't need the government to come along and try and force that to happen. If you want to know if your kid if your high school student is having sex, hopefully the answer there is have a good relationship with your kid so they feel comfortable opening up to you and talking with you. You shouldn't need the Florida legislature and Ron DeSantis to force your kid to tell you about that, right? These are pitched by the same legislators that often describe themselves as libertarian and how they just want government out of the way when in this particular arena, they want the most invasive government imaginable for most people. Anyway, I'm ranting a little bit on this, but here's where abortion comes in. So this legislation essentially overrides any place in law where a minor can access healthcare services without telling a parent. And one of the places that potentially implicates is Florida has what are known as parental consent and parental notification and parental consent laws for abortions. And basically what that means, if you are under the age of 18 and you want an abortion, you need to get an abortion, you are forbidden from doing so unless you have, initially it was notification, but now it is consent from a parent, written consent from a parent. I may have talked about this before, but parental notification was actually the big abortion issue of the time when I first showed up in Tallahassee, like 2004-ish time frame. And it has always struck me as kind of the quintessential issue that illustrates how like deceptively simple these things often sound, but like how like complicated and dangerous they actually are in effect. So kind of to the point I was alluding to earlier, like, of course, any of us would want to know if we had a child who was pregnant and was thinking about getting an abortion. We would want to be there to help them, to comfort them, to counsel them, to make sure that they're making the best decision for themselves and their future, that sort of stuff. But again, if you have a healthy relationship with your child, that's going to happen. They're going to talk to you before making major decisions like this. The folks that get affected by forced mandatory consent or notification laws are teens that are in dangerous family situations, teens that for whatever reason cannot talk to a parent about this stuff. Maybe they'll get thrown out of the house. Maybe they're a victim of abuse of some kind. It will put them in danger somehow if they go. And those are the people that get impacted when the government steps in to say what they can and cannot do without like talking to their parents first. And so the way supporters of mandatory consent and notification laws have always addressed that issue is with what back in my day was called judicial bypass, although I think I hear people call it judicial waiver more often than is that essentially if you're a teenager who needs an abortion and it would be dangerous for you to get consent from a parent, you can instead go to court and make the case for why it would be dangerous to get a parental consent and get what is called a judicial waiver from the law. So essentially essentially a court order allowing you to get an abortion without your parents' explicit approval. Again, it's an incredibly cumbersome process. It doesn't solve a lot of the issues like telling a 16-year-old that she's got to go to court to avoid this is like a really daunting ask to begin with, but at least it's a mechanism around the potential harmful impacts of these mandatory consent laws. But then you take a bill like Senate Bill 1288, which is essentially overriding all that. It is saying that no, you can't get any kind of healthcare procedure without a parental permission. And obviously, that's going to create a direct conflict with the judicial waiver provisions in the state's mandatory consent laws. Now, it's not entirely clear what would happen here. Partially, there's a constitutional element to the judicial bypass issue. Like this is an issue part of this is in Florida's constitution, but there's like a clear conflict here. So there's going to have to be some sort of litigation to resolve this. And like shout out to the legislative staffers that have flagged this an issue, sort of like, like raising this red flag, like, hey, it's sort of uncertain how we kind of reconcile this idea that parents have the right to approve any healthcare decisions for their child, but also, minors have the right to go to court to get around parental consent in abortion cases. And so that's going to trigger a lawsuit. And why that is so dangerous is there is already a movement on the right, a legal movement on the right to get judicial waiver and judicial bypass mechanisms thrown out entirely. So we had a court case in Florida not too long ago involving a minor seeking a judicial bypass or a judicial waiver. And it was denied at the appellate court level. And if I'm remembering correctly, there was a concurring opinion in that case from a particularly right-wing judge arguing that the entire notion of judicial bypass was unconstitutional under the federal constitution. So even though it's in the state constitution, it violates the federal constitution. And it's been a while since I've read this. But broadly speaking, the argument here was that essentially the adverse party in these cases are deprived of their due process rights because the adverse party is the parent who is supposed to have the right to be notified or to consent to any abortion. They don't get to defend themselves in these hearings or make their arguments because, again, the whole point of these hearings is to go around the parent when it would be dangerous if you needed to go to them. So there's an effort already underway to get this whole mechanism just thrown out entirely and essentially go back to making parental consent and notification laws universal and just like forget the teens in these dangerous situations that we were allegedly trying to help before and just like tough luck, right? And a bill like Senate Bill 1288, whether or not that's the intention of the sponsor, and I'm not looking inside anybody's brain. I don't know what they're thinking inside their heart of hearts, but whether or not it's the intention, a bill like Senate Bill 1288 is going to further that effort and potentially trigger the showdown that allows the court, if it wants to just throw out judicial bypass entirely, right? In which case, you have just expanded Florida's abortion ban even further without ever putting abortion in your bill. And so that bill went through the Senate Judiciary yesterday, 8-3. It's also moving in the House. I don't want to give you the wrong bill number here, so I'll throw a link to both bills in the show notes. The Senate Judiciary Committee also heard yesterday Senate Bill 1284, and this is one we have talked about before. This is the bill to essentially give the same try and extend some of the same civil liability rights to an embryo as like a living person. It would essentially allow someone to file a wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of a fetus, if a pregnancy is lost in some sort of, through some sort of negligence or accident or something like this. The reason a bill like this is so dangerous in the abortion context is for a long time, there has also been a movement on the far right, a legal movement on the far right to try and establish this notion of what is sometimes called fetal personhood. And the idea is to create the legal architecture that essentially says that a fetus is, under the eyes of the law, no different than, a 30-year-old person, that they have the exact same rights to, they're legally speaking, there's no difference. That is a zygote is a person, right? And if you allow that idea to take root, or if you operate from that idea, then of course abortion becomes impossible. You ban all abortion in any situation, no matter what, right? Because you can't abort a 30-year-old person. So if the 30-year-old person has the right to live, then the week old fertilized egg, the egg that was fertilized a week ago. Sorry, I'm tangling up my language here. They also have that same right. So abortion becomes murder, statutorily speaking, right? Which is, obviously, you hear people use that phrase all the time. That's the goal. That's the legal goal of these personhood bills. And we already know in Florida, we've talked about this a lot before, there's a lot of support for that on the Florida courts. The Florida Supreme Court, I think we've got 6 of 7 justices, I believe, have already kind of signaled in opinions that they are ready to rule that a fetus is a person under the Florida Constitution. So a bill like Senate Bill 1288 is teeing that issue up for a full resolution in the courts. And again, this is another bill where supporters keep talking about how this has nothing to do with abortion. It has everything to do with abortion, whether or not, again, can't see into somebody's brain or somebody's heart, whether or not they really believe it when they say this has nothing to do with abortion. It's just not true. It has everything to do with abortion, and this is a bill that could ultimately lead to Florida's 6-week abortion ban being what is like 0-week abortion, but 1-day abortion ban, essentially, 1-hour abortion ban. Now, I will say Senate Bill 1284, it went through on a narrow vote. I think this was 6-4 in Senate Judiciary. You actually had a couple of Republicans vote against this bill. This wasn't just, Democratic legislators who support abortion rights arguing against it. And I do want to give sort of a shout out to the Republicans who raised some real concerns with it. There was Senator Tom Leek, who's a Republican from the Daytona Beach area, I think is where he's at. He expressed some real concerns about this bill unintentionally creating all sorts of cause of actions against a mother who loses her pregnancy, like essentially creating situations where a mother can be sued for somehow if she loses a pregnancy somehow. And obviously a bill like this is going to be filled with unintended consequences. So like, you're absolutely right to be cognizant of those potential unintended consequences. I think the other Republican no vote on this bill came from former Senate President Kathleen Passidomo. She was the Senate President the last term. And she really sort of drilled in onto the craziness of this idea that we can even begin to quantify like civil lawsuit damages for the loss of, a zygote, basically. Like, how on earth do you quantify like the future life earnings of an egg that was fertilized a week ago? That fertilized egg might develop into, a billionaire investor. It might also never be born, right? It might also, be born with a disability. It might also just become someone that works a minimum wage job their whole life. Like there's just no potential way to even begin to quantify that sort of thing in any kind of like, realistic fact-based way. And President Passidomo was making the case that this is like, you're just creating like this legal morass around this stuff that's just going to like create all sorts of tort actions and legal mess. And she's absolutely right about that. So the fact that bill just barely budged by makes me think that, there is some hope that all of these kind of external consequences to the bill, which again, like the sponsor of these bills never want to talk about. They never want to address those. They want to try and pretend that this is just some simple bill when it is as far from that as you can get. It does make me think that some of those extra negative externalities, I don't even know if I'm using that right in this context, but will ultimately doom this bill. But the challenge here is it's not going away. Like, I mean, so one thing they've tried to do to water this or to address some of the concerns, fetal personhood was what has eventually caused Alabama to briefly shut down in vitro fertilization because, essentially the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that like an embryo in a test tube was as much of a person as an embryo in a womb, right? And so this bill tries to get around this by saying it only applies these new negligence, these new civil liability rights would only apply to fetuses in the womb. But like, even then, you already had like these really right-wing anti-abortion activists testifying like they don't want that. They want this to also apply to the in vitro embryos as well. And again, you have to remember that we're dealing with a legislative body that is not, it is completely untethered from the sort of the mainstream of the electorate. These are gerrymandered districts. It is the people like these extremists that decide their elections. And, what sounds crazy today is like mainstream debate 3 years from now. So should have passed Amendment 4. That's what can I tell you? Maybe we'll get another shot at that. Although, as we've talked about, the legislature is sure working on a bunch of bills to make sure that doesn't happen either. So let me just run through two other things that I haven't talked about before. The House Government Operations Subcommittee started moving a giant elections bill. This is like clockwork. Every year, the Florida legislature, about midway through session, seems to like start working on some like giant election bill that just creates new barriers to voting. The focus of this one is on like, it's allegedly around trying to stop non-citizens from voting, which again, set aside the fact that there's never any evidence presented of any kind of widespread problem. And it can lead to all sorts of issues where if you go to try and update your voter registration and you don't have a birth certificate or passport with you, or if, God forbid you're a woman with a married name whose married name is different than your birth certificate name, it can lead to all sorts of complications there. I kind of want to single out this bill for another just really really sort of intentionally, dickish thing to be doing. One of the things this bill does is it stops allowing student IDs to be used as a valid form of ID when voting, and that is. There's no point to that other than to try and drive down young turnout, right? To try and stop college, make it harder for college kids to vote, which, anybody who's ever been involved with, or anybody involved with elections knows that trying to get college kids to vote, that's a big lift. So you want to make that process as frictionless as possible. This is a thing designed to increase the friction on that for no other reason other than the supporters of this bill don't think young people are going to support them, so they don't want young people voting. And so they're going to strip student IDs as a valid form of ID. It's just a dick thing to do. Last bill I'll mention real quickly, the Senate Judiciary Committee also passed Senate Bill 922. This is one we have also talked about before. This would strengthen non-compete contracts in Florida. It would give corporations far more power to bind many of their employees to longer and stronger non-competes. It's a horribly anti-worker thing to be doing. Non-competes are just fundamentally anti-worker. The reason I flag this, we actually just had a story on the newsletter that showed that this bill was actually written by a lobbyist for a billionaire-run hedge fund, a hedge fund called Citadel that is run by Miami billionaire Ken Griffin, who is also just so happens one of I think the largest individual campaign contributor in all of Florida politics. Gave something like more than $28 million in campaign contributions, state level campaign contributions during the 2024 election cycles, including $4 million each to funds controlled by the Speaker of the State House and the President of the State Senate. And I flag all that too. So I'll throw a link to that story into the show notes, but I also flag that because we've got campaign finance reports coming for the first quarter. So we're about to start seeing some of the money that poured into legislator accounts in the last 2 months and 2 months and a few days before session began, which is really usually just a gross orgy of fundraising time, and the reality is we should have actually known this more than a month ago, but a couple of years ago, Ron DeSantis in the legislature weakened the state's campaign finance laws. The first time I had seen that happen in my 20 years doing this. Used to have to report this stuff monthly. They took that away, and now, so we're getting it quarterly. So anyway, first quarter reports are coming in. They should start trickling in, over the next couple of days. And I think by the 10th, they all have to be in. So obviously I'm sure we'll have lots to say about that, but hopefully lots of other journalists will be looking at that sort of stuff too. Cause the reality is money has a lot of influence in sort of the decisions that are being made in the Florida legislature right now. So, okay, we're going to leave it there. We'll be back again tomorrow for a day 30 update when we are officially halfway home through the 2025 legislative session. If you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription. SeekingRentsFL.com is the easiest place to find us. Also, however you're watching or viewing this, if you don't mind, click in, like, and subscribe. Hit those buttons. That helps us spread the content around. And please feel free to leave us a review. Or if you got any thoughts or comments, leave a comment too. So, okay, we'll talk again tomorrow. Take care.